It's hit.
It's it. Perfect. So I asked you to come up with a pseudonym. The schema that Linda Hill and I have been using is the initials L and H because we're prioritizing liberty and happiness. But since you're not really on board with us yet, or I doubt that you ever really will be, you're going to be more of a foil in this, I think, than a companion. Foils can be companions. Than an ally. uh, I asked you to come up with your own names using the initials that correspond with whatever you're going to be prioritizing. And you said something which I've now forgotten. What was it?
It's Charlie S. Troy.
Charlie S. Troy. And that stands for what again?
CST, Catholic Social Teaching. It's just like Catholic would be one, so I could just be Charlie, but
Full names.
yeah, full names. I'll just do Charlie Troy.
Charlie Troy. That's fine. Well, the S is good because social teachings. I mean, I guess Catholic teachings is still close enough, but all right. You said something about like the echoes of war or war echoes or something.
Charlie and Troy. Like, where's Charlie? Vietnam, and then Troy, like ancient Greek. I typed it out, and then I realized that both of them related to war. I was like, all right, that works.
Was that a reference that you thought would like come across?
War, Charlie, Troy. I just think they all work.
I'm gonna have to. That'll be my first disagreement with you, my friend.
All right, let's get started.
So you and I talked for 2.5 hours the other day about some serious stuff and some more joking around stuff. And when I pitched to you the Lionheart axiom that two things have value: liberty, the ability for people to control their own experience, and happiness, which is the inverse of suffering, which is a person's awareness of loss. You said that you thought that liberty and happiness did have value, but that those weren't definitions that you agreed with. That you didn't agree with defining liberty and happiness in that way. Is that still what you think?
It's still what I think.
I asked you then to come up with a better definition for one or the other, or both. And you gave the example of I think it was Aristotle's definition of liberty, which was everything to its purpose, or everything to its end, or something. Which I then disagreed with, saying, you gave the example that an acorn should be allowed to become an oak tree, that an acorn becoming an oak tree is liberty in action. And I said, by that token, one could defend, like if one was a slave owner in the South in America in the 1800s, one could say that the end of a slave was to serve his master, and could justify the enslavement of this man using Aristotle's definition of liberty. That according to Aristotle's definition of liberty, he was not at odds with this valuable thing. And I came up with, or I recognized the flaw with this definition, which is that Aristotle has to be referencing some obvious natural end that is, clear for every object and every being. And in the absence of that, everyone is free to decide for themselves what the end of this thing in front of you is. And one can say that a man and a slave has the end of a slave rather than the end of a man, whatever. And if it's not and anyone can say what the end of man is, you know what I mean? Everyone makes up their own nonsense about what things are supposed to be, and then says that it's obvious, and then says that making things follow their imagined track is the definition of liberty. And I think that makes it a poor working definition, because we can't really support some positions over others using that definition. I again mentioned this to you last when we spoke earlier, that you have a preference for talking about the most abstract parts of this conversation, and I mentioned that I'm only interested in finding answers in the abstract so that I can use them to find utilitarian answers. And that's really where my aim is. But since you love discussing the abstracts, I thought that we could go over some other potential definitions of liberty and happiness, and we could defend. I will defend mine as best I can, and you can attack and defend others as best you like. Or if anything else comes to mind, you can interrupt and take us wherever you want to go. I'm cool with that. Whatever you want. And if we like doing this, we'll do it some more. And
Yeah.
if we end this because it's time for you to leave and you have stuff that's still on your mind, then we can come back next week and we can keep going. But for now,
I guess if we're going abstract, and thank you for letting me go there. The first issue I'd like to hear your thoughts on is, so basically, your definition of freedom and happiness.
liberty and happiness.
Liberty and happiness. Yeah, you're not Hook, you're Luke. The attractive part of it is it's kind of it is a neutral thing that everyone can agree to, and it can endure the situation of plurality where we have different, like you said, different ideas of human happiness and different ways to get there. So yours proposes a stable definition that everyone can work with. It's like an interface that no matter what your ideas of human happiness, input, output, and it's all this nice and clean deal, everyone is happy.
I will say that the flexibility of this axiom is one of the things that I find attractive about it, both because it will be a route back to unity, a way to kind of find common ground among all the people that disagree in this country and the world. And also because I think that it has to be flexible. Not only do I think that any axiom that we choose has to have universality and not be dependent on a certain space or time. It can't only operate in a certain space and time, but it also needs to be able to apply to many, many, many different situations. I can kind of hear in what you're saying where you're going. You're using words like nice and clean in describing what I'm wanting from this.
I'm offering a critique.
I that is something that somebody says only when they're about to criticize that life is more complicated than that. And I'm not trying to be clean exactly. I'm just trying to.
Well, that's not where I'm going. Where I was going. I don't know. I want to hear your thoughts on this. I'm wondering whether it is possible to have a neutral idea of the human good and to use that as a flexible interface. I don't know if we can find a better word.
I don't really know what you mean by neutral in this sense.
Neutral in that no matter what your ideology, no matter what your ideas, you can go to this definition of liberty and happiness, and through it, your rights will be preserved. You'll be satisfied, and no one's going to take advantage of you. That's the deal.
I would more say it doesn't depend on you being American versus Chinese, or man or woman, or young or old, or living today versus living 6,000 years ago. I wouldn't say that this can be preserved across any potential ideology. I mean, you yourself are quite religious, and I expect that, considering that you've named yourself after Christian social teachings, yeah? Christian social teachings?
You gave away my pseudonym, Luke. Catholic social teaching, yeah.
I know from speaking to you that you prioritize having a relationship to God, and your description of how one relates to God involves obedience, and maintaining an individual person's control over their own experience is at odds with obeying an ultimate authority figure, I think.
Well, we don't have to go to that level. And that's, maybe where I should find a different name. what I definitely would not advocate for, because the reality is plurality, that we can't, America can't be under a Catholic king or any other religious king.
I
So
appreciate you saying so. When I was imagining how this conversation would go, I was wondering how you would.
no, yeah, I no. The project here is like what standard of justice can we, or whatever this is, like put forward so that everyone one agrees with it and finds it useful enough to actually use it.
Yeah, it's
And
how do we build our earthly nation?
Yeah,
And I think that there are many people in the world who want to build the earthly nation out of Scripture, who want Scripture to be the basis of the earthly nation. These people are called theocrats, and the nations they build are called theocracies. And I personally have a lot of distaste for theocracy, and I wonder how deeply religious people can justify faith being the most important thing, but not being the ultimate law of the land. And if it is out of this awareness for plurality and this understanding that the nation has to be to the good of all, not just to the good of Catholics or Jews or whatever, then I appreciate that. I'm glad that you've come to that conclusion. It's a conclusion that I share with you.
yeah. I'm sorry that hasn't been clear before.
It's not about you. I'm more thinking about many other people. You can go on the internet and find examples of crazy people believing anything, and there are certainly many examples of theocrats on the internet.
Can I say one thing? I think we don't have to talk about religion after this, but I think a fair way to, at least the way that I kind of see it, is like you kind of mentioned, people who prioritize faith. It's kind of antithetical for them to even think about just building a human city. And I think the way that we should look at faith is, I mean, at least Catholicism looks at faith as continuous and building off of a basis of reason that everyone has a share of. So you're not kind of going against faith by just limiting yourself to reason. I mean, it's not the fullness, but I can enter into this discussion because, because it's all continuous. But let that be everything that we say about religion, just because no one agrees on it.
Okay, I mean, I don't think that we have to be limited in our discussion of religion, but certainly there's many other things to talk about, and we can talk about how to build the earthly city, not in regards to religion, and I'll be perfectly happy. So, if you feel inclined to talk about it, don't hesitate, but if you don't, no skin off my ass. So, liberty and happiness. You still don't like my definitions. I think that I've done a decent job of defending against Aristotle's definition, but if you have any others, I'll take them on.
Well, first, what I was trying to bring up is let's examine whether it's. I guess you had issues with the term neutral. I want to know if it's neutral. So can you state the definitions again?
Liberty is the ability for an individual person to control their own experience, and happiness is the inverse of suffering, which is a person's awareness of loss. And the Lionheart axiom is that liberty and happiness both have value.
It's just a little. Here's my hang up, is that this idea of liberty, this idea of happiness as the absence of suffering. Maybe I'll just. It's vague in the definition, so maybe I should just hear your explanation of a situation. Let's say the situation is. Should we go straight to it? Gay marriage. What do you? How would you? I mean, that's a kind of a toss up for. I mean, not a toss up, a layup for you. But how would gay marriage handle? You got different people with different ideas of marriage. And some say, on the one hand, that, like, listen, in order to have a good and healthy society, you need kids to have a mom and a dad. And it's not that we want to deny anyone love, it's that that's just not what marriage is. And then we have other people on the other hand saying, you're denying us marriage when, like, we're equal citizens and, like, we love each other. And they'd like to dispute the fact that, that you need a mom and a dad to raise a kid. And they just think it's a matter of liberty being denied them. How would your principles resolve it?
Well, I would say several things. I would say, firstly, that I see marriage as a civil institution, not a religious one. it has been kind of blended with religion, partly because religion has um, related itself to how people mate and have kids. That is one of the things that it very frequently ties itself to in all manner of different religions. But well, maybe not monogamous partnership, but uh, it is part of the Homo sapien species reproductive strategy to invest a lot in its offspring. We have 9 months of gestation, and then 15 years before you can become a functioning sexually mature adult. And in that period of time, you need to have pretty much all your needs taken care of by your parents and by the surrounding tribe as well. So, in species where the offspring needs a lot of attention in order to grow up healthily or to mature healthily, then it is common for the parents to stick around for the life of the offspring and raise it. That includes Homo sapien. Homo sapien maybe more than any other animal because our vast intelligence requires tons and tons of time to develop or to mature. Has changed our bodies and made our bodies require tons of time to mature. So, for that reason, sexual partners, when they're making offspring, link together. And in addition to this, sex has obviously reproductive function, but it also has a lot of social function. In the same way that your mouth is used to breathe and to eat, but also to talk, so is sex used to reproduce, and I guess our genitals to urinate, and also to socialize. And so there are ingrained in us instinctual behaviors to mate, maybe not permanently, maybe not monogamously, but to mate when having children. And to have sex outside the context of bearing children to form deep personal bonds with other humans. And I think that marriage is this acknowledgement that we have a sexual bond which has social and reproductive implications, and we are starting a family. Or we should be considered as a single unit because our destinies are now entwined. And that is to me what marriage is. I know that that from the Catholic perspective, marriage is a union in the eyes of God, but I think that's a definition only as old as the Catholic Church, which is to say not as old as the human race. And I think that that's what marriage is. When I think of marriage, I think a permanent, although now we have a way out, divorce, a permanent romantic and family building bond between sexual partners who are, building a family. And to me, restricting that to one male and one female seems like pointless. I mean, that's not what it's about. There are ways to have children, like by adopting or by, now in the modern world, we can, gay people can have children by transferring, embryos to other wombs or whatever. There are ways to build families without having, one male and one female. And the only important thing in my mind to raising a child is, well, I think that there are benefits to having masculine role models and feminine role models, but that isn't to say that that's the only way that it can be done, and that if that isn't an option, that you can't do it then. You know what I mean? That's like, I also wouldn't say that, like, single women can't adopt if they demonstrate that they're capable of doing so, if they demonstrate that they'll love the child and that they can support themselves and the child and stuff. I don't think that the child has to remain an orphan or remain in foster care and has to wait for a better option. So yes, I see no reason why people can't be allowed to decide for themselves who they mate with and who they form family building partnerships with. So to me, it is pro liberty for people to be allowed to choose to do it with people of the same sex if that's what they wish, if it's mutually agreed upon between people. In addition to that, in the modern world, a lot of people are suffering, to relate it not only to liberty but also to happiness, are suffering because of the ostracization that has come with being gay. Because there are many institutions that historically ostracize gay people. And I think that there are pangs of suffering when there is pointless detriment to gay people, saying your love is invalid. And while maybe that's not a good enough reason on its own, it's certainly a nice benefit that all these people who were suffering are now no longer suffering that particular pain, because they're not being... You said something earlier that liberty is tied to happiness, and I agree with you. I think that when people's liberty is restricted, they also suffer. They experience some suffering. So I think that there is less suffering now that people feel like they're able to choose what they want to do and don't feel, yoked to some other people's random prejudices and preconceptions. So that's how I would defend gay marriage. I think that gay marriage is a pro-liberty and happiness position. Or rather, supporting gay marriage being valid, legal, everything is pro-liberty and happiness.
Gotcha.
Now, what about a kid whose parents are just super soft and they're just like, oh, I didn't like when my parents disciplined me, so I'm just going to be super free with this kid. This kind of idea of liberty as do whatever you want, but as a child.
Childhood is unique. And I mentioned this to you earlier. I mean, the realities of our biology is that we are not mature until we turn like 15 or whatever. We can't fend for ourselves, we can't, protect ourselves, we can't feed ourselves. And the convention in our civilization is for children to have zero liberty when they're babies, and to gradually be restored more and more liberty over time as they mature and become adults. So liberty has the realities of our biology demand a special exception to liberty in the case of children, where they are future people. They don't have liberty at the beginning, and they get more and more and more of it over time, and eventually it is completely restored to them. And if withholding liberty from non-mature humans is deemed to be abusive, if parents are abusing their children and their children want to escape but can't because their parents are being allowed to make decisions for them, then we have a way out for that. It's called emancipation. Emancipation is literally the restoring of liberties. And I think I like that system how it is. And if if they're too young even for that, then the state will separate the children from the parents and give them to a foster family who hopefully will do a better job of keeping the kid happy, even at the temporary expense of their liberty. So I don't think that parents refusing to discipline their kids, whatever, is the best thing for liberty and happiness, because parents and children have a special relationship where parents withhold liberty and we all accept it temporarily for the sake of the child's happiness. Over time as they become adults.
I think that's super interesting. Obviously very practical, like just common sense, that makes sense, like they're immature. But who, getting to the fringe of the definition, I think helps to clarify, the limits of it. Who decides that they're immature?
Well, we use the benchmark of sexual maturity, and just, age happening over time. But there's no definitive way of measuring it. Even if there was a specific age, then There's no benchmark that could be used in all cases. What happens is
Sure, but you have a general sense, like you said, like around 15. Maybe it's 20 for some kids, maybe it's 10 for some kids. But I mean, there might not be a clear benchmark, but there definitely is a benchmark.
I would say that the borders are fuzzy, and I'm more accepting of fuzzy borders than I think a lot of people are.
But that wasn't the question. I
Yeah.
admit that.
So I can't just give an age, but around like 15 is when kids are mature enough that if there's an abusive relationship, they should have a right to restore their liberties and become a person not dependent on a primary caretaker. Uh, but otherwise, arbitrarily we've chosen 18. I'm not going to invest any capital, any political capital, whatever, in trying to change that. That's as good as any. I don't know of any objective process that I could use to change that. It's kind of like when should you be allowed to drink? You know what I mean? Like, drinking for children is bad because it stunts brain development and stuff that can't. It causes damage. So at some point it stops doing that, and around that point we let them drink of their own volition. So I don't. I don't have any expertise in this. I can't say. I don't know enough about human development, human maturation, that I can give a closer answer. If an expert tells me that it should be something.
You're saying is that
We can look at sexual development. We can look at the development of the brain.
Yeah,
to kind of
we
find...
use sexual development, but really the development of the brain is what's important, because the person's mind, their decision making, their feeling, whatever, that's the important part, not their gender.
And I think that's interesting because you use, let's just say, the brain to eliminate a certain group, a large group of people, from the pool of people who get to enjoy liberty and happiness. And I'm not pushing it because it's like it's impractical. It's definitely practical, but I think you're saying that you're entering a norm into this apparently normless definition that you can't just bring out of nowhere. You have to have a justification for, like, why are these humans? Why is a 5-year-old not allowed to decide how to parent himself?
Yeah, and again, that is like I've said that it shouldn't be that the axiom should be true in all cases, right? It shouldn't be, or rather, it should not be dependent on space or time, right? It should be true in America or in China, true today, 1,000 years ago, or 1,000 years in the future, right? That's how I described it. What I just gave, this way of handling childhood in Homo sapien, is something that will only apply to Homo sapien children. You know what I mean? And I'm giving an example of how to handle it that is basically explaining why our current system is good enough. I'm not trying to say that this is the only way to do it. I'm saying that right now there's like a cost of liberty over this period of time to the great benefit of happiness for that period of time, and that will eventually fade, and that cost of liberty is temporary. All I'm doing is saying, looking at that exchange, I think that exchange is worth it. In this case, I wouldn't use this to project other answers for if our species changes at all, and I'm only going based on the qualities of Homo sapien and the way that the world is today. That's the information that I'm invoking in this answer.
No, but you're evading the question. I think you no, let's see. It's not a matter of like considering like, all right, well, what if humans were different? It's the point I'm trying to get to is I don't think that again, practically I agree with you. Like, no, there's the question that I'm pressing really has no relevance.
Yeah, it's just about abstractions.
Yeah, it's an abstraction, and theoretically gets to the point of I think that you also are an Aristotelian.
I don't know what that means. An
Aristotelian, okay, you're ends oriented. You're oriented toward the end.
Yeah, I use the word utilitarian, which I think is close enough, I guess.
But utilitarian is the end is pleasure and the absence of pain, and I think you have a very definite idea of what is pleasure and what is pain that not everyone would agree with.
That's not how I've understood utilitarianism, but I think that you've done more formal research on different philosophies than I have, so I trust your definitions over the different camps than I would trust my own.
Okay, yeah. I mean, yeah, that's the basic definition of utilitarianism, and obviously, like, not just always base pleasures, but whatever pleasures humans get, you know.
Sure.
So let me just try to ask you some questions. So you're saying that under this program, this definition of liberty and freedom, liberty and happiness, a certain group gets to enjoy that said liberty, and a certain group does not. Correct?
Everyone is entitled to it. For this group of people, we can we can imagine their liberty and happiness, and the optimal liberty and happiness for them in their situation is to remove liberty for the sake of their happiness, because they start off limited, and as they mature, grant liberty and let them, determine their own happiness.
That's fascinating. So that you'll admit sounds a lot like, well, this acorn, in order for it to be a full acorn, needs to forego its certain liberties so that it can grow up and to be an oak tree, which has a definite idea of teleology.
I mean, Aristotle's definition brushes up against the truth, which is not interfering with things and letting things develop as they will. What I don't like about Aristotle's definition is that Aristotle's definition implies that there is a natural end that can be understood by other people and should be preserved by other people. Or rather, in my definition, I say that there is no end outside of what the person is choosing for themselves. And Aristotle's definition, like an acorn isn't sentient, and it implies that even objects have a natural end that we should be supporting, that it's valuable to realize. Yeah. So I don't like, A, that it's being applied to objects, and B, that it's invoking some natural order. I just like both of those things. I much prefer the end, instead of being bound to some natural law, being up to the individual to decide for themselves. I think that using that definition will create a society that is closer to the one that I most prefer to live in.
But I think, but even you don't do that. I mean, you even admit that you like, well, we can't do liberty as one sees liberty to be, or like, yeah, whatever, pursue happiness in whatever ways you want it, because that's why I bring up the child example, because there are certain groups of population that don't know what that is for them, and there's also the mentally ill. There's drug addicts who want the drugs and they don't need the drugs, and so we need I feel like I think that's a huge. Actually, no, I'm not going to go the practical route. Practically I could see our way around it, but I guess the point that I'm pressing is. Even when you push this idea of, I'm just saying, it seems neutral and fair, that everyone gets to decide his own happiness, but even that is a specific prescription for what is man's final end, and again, that curtails some other people's ideas of what their end should be, and it forwards on others and yours. For example, it's for the same reason that it's not good for the kid to be able to eat candy whenever he wants. I think it's also not good for a society to be able to eat whatever it wants. I think it's better for a society to kind of a culture to kind of pick and choose, like, okay, these are healthy options, like maybe we shouldn't have McDonald's around.
That's interesting. So would you support the government like taxing junk food more in order to discourage people from eating it?
In America, that's pointless. We're way beyond that.
You're saying that no tax could be strong enough to actually influence that behavior.
No, I'm saying people will get pissed off.
But that's just saying that it wouldn't work politically. I'm saying if you're king and you push a button, whatever, and you can make you know, in your ideal world is the government is.
I think that's a great thing to bring up. In my ideal world, it is a kingship, and again, it's ideal, but it's a perfect king, so he knows what's good for its subjects and everything.
It's the Pope.
There have been bad popes, but basically, I think that a perfect kingship, or let's just use the Aristotelian term, kingship, because the abused form of it is tyranny. A kingship allows for greater happiness than a society in which there is more of your liberty according to Lionheart, because in that curtailing of liberty, it actually allows more happiness, and I think that is. Let me try to think of some examples. The burden of governing, the burden of having to decide, is taken off the shoulders of the people, which, given all the clamor for people wanting to self-govern, you could say, do people really find that a burden? I look at political discussions, I look at the strife between people and different parties, and that would be quite a burden lifted for us to just kind of know that the king wants the best and just obey. Now, I'm not really putting it forward as anything. I just think it's an interesting antidote to it just calls into question the liberty component.
Well, by that you're still not disputing that liberty and happiness have value. You're describing a situation where a cost of some liberty would be worth a gain of some happiness. That's what a kingship. That, according to what you described, a kingship would be one case that was worth it. And again, I'm saying that both liberty and happiness have value, and so.
Oh, okay, right.
A sacrifice of X liberty for a gain of Y happiness, you don't know until you think about it whether or not it's worth it. What I am saying is that, if we can agree that that's the case, that liberty and happiness both have value, I think that I can pull some people who only care about happiness. I think I can get them to recognize the value of liberty. The people who only care about liberty, I think that I can get them to recognize the value of happiness. And
I see what you're saying.
I think that I can use that as the bridge to unite people. For people who are theocrats or are guided by some other desire for, their for people who want supremacy of some sect which they belong to, I don't know if I can reach those people. But for people who value liberty and happiness, I think, or who in their hearts value liberty and happiness but are only focusing on one in our political discourse, I think that I can get them to kind of add another dimension to their thinking, and maybe that can help.
Okay, that helps a lot. That's really interesting. Okay, so there's not... Okay. So you can, violate some liberty if it's going to mean an inordinate gain in happiness.
It's an exchange, and you just have to say, is this time, is this worth it?
Gotcha.
That's how I think we need to approach civic issues in this country. I think it's the only way to do it. But I think that articulating that these are the criteria, these are the parameters, this is what we're going to be accounting for and then judging, I think that will lead to less bullshit.
Would you... This is going to be totally unfair, but I'll just go for it. When you mention, some people care about happiness, some people think about liberty, can you point to some examples? Is it basically Republicans are super occupied with liberty and Democrats are more concerned with happiness, or what?
I think that roughly liberty and happiness map to political parties in this country this way. I think that liberals tend to prioritize happiness. They'll say, we'll restrict some people's ability to make decisions for themselves if it'll prevent people from suffering elsewhere. I think that libertarians will tend to prioritize liberty and say it's not worth it to restrict people's ability to choose for themselves, even if it gains that kind of happiness. And I think that conservatives have some overlap with libertarians, and they'll tend to take free market positions. They'll tend to prioritize liberty more than they will prioritize happiness. But they're also taking on this other value, a value that I don't value, which is traditionalism, specifically religious traditionalism, where not only will they be trying to say, let's not have the government decide, they will also say, if, in order to maintain our traditions, in order to keep our culture the same as it was before, we'll restrict other people's ability to do stuff. Like marijuana is a classic example, or gay marriage is another classic example. I think that, what are libertarians' positions on these? They're supportive of the legalization of marijuana, and they're supportive of gay marriage in general. It's only when you add in that aspect of traditionalism, again, specifically religious traditionalism, that you get this new set of positions where we're just trying to, I wouldn't be so... I wouldn't call the average Republican a true Christian supremacist, but I think that a lot of them do say the Christian way is the better way, even if that means making other people do things the Christian way, even if they're not Christian. There's also the real freaks in the conservative side who are like white nationalists or whatever, again saying traditionally America is a white country and whites built it and whites deserve it and whites are entitled to it. Again, those are the freaks. They have, I would say, minimal real impact on the actual party's platform. They might occasionally get a candidate who really resonates with that in office, but the majority of the platform has nothing to do with that.
I'm surprised it seems to, between conservative and liberal, seems to divide along religious lines. I thought it would be more economic.
You mean libertarian or conservative?
No.
I will say that between liberal and libertarian, it's primarily economic, which is, the thing that kids are usually taught about libertarians is that they're social liberals and fiscal conservatives. That's the classic thing that kids are told about libertarians. And I'm going to go the Ron Swanson route and say that it shouldn't be defined as either. It shouldn't be defined in terms of liberal and conservative, that it should be its own thing, just valuing liberty above all. What I did was I said, here's liberals, here's libertarians in relation to the liberals, and here's conservatives in relation to libertarians. Yeah. So a lot of the conservative positions have similar relations to the liberal position as the libertarian positions do. Yeah. But again, I can see the value in a lot of libertarian positions because I can see that they're pushing for liberty, and that essentially what they're saying is that this sacrifice of liberty isn't worth this gain of happiness. And I think that's valid. But there are a lot of conservative positions that are just completely off my radar, and I can't in good conscience support because they're not born out of a desire for liberty. They're merely born out of a desire to make the state enforce.
For dogmatism, yeah.
What'd you say? What was the word?
For dogmatism.
Dogmatism, sure.
Their own dogma, outside of liberty and happiness.
And for that reason, I don't see Republicans as champions of liberty. I see libertarians as a much better champion of liberty. And if I had my druthers, the two-party system, if we were still stuck with the two-party system, the two parties would be liberals and libertarians. And that would be the conversation. But that's not the world we live in today. I will do what I can to push for that to be more the case. I will push for the Conservative Party to become more like the Libertarian Party. But it's going to be a hard fight, and it probably won't be one in my lifetime, if it ever is. But that's closer to my ideal world. We don't have a lot more time. You want to? I'm trying to answer your challenges as best I can.
Yeah, you're doing great. You're doing great.
You got another one in you?
I'm just worried about this, the arbiter, of take the example of, and um, yeah, I think it's a more a clear example between libertarian and liberals. Both obviously want, let's say, the happiness that comes from a bull market, right?
Sure.
And one says, listen, the way you get that is through government regulation, and obviously we're speaking in extremes, state control, and just like keeping tabs on big business. And the other says, just get the government out of the way as small as possible.
Well, I think that would be I'm going to make that a little bit less simplistic in that the priorities of liberals is not limited to the Dow Jones being as high as possible. Liberals will be, if libertarians say, hey, you want higher wages for everybody, they'll say sure, but the market isn't going to necessarily do that on its own. And there are a lot of ways that the market naturally molds itself that aren't actually best for the economy as a whole, the well-being of every individual as a whole. Like, for example, monopolies and trusts. This was more of a problem in the 1920s and stuff, when businesses would agree not to compete with each other. And then we don't have a highly competitive market which is getting all of these better goods and services for cheaper. We just have a bunch of rich people agreeing not to get in each other's way and buying up any newcomers, and they get more and more of the pie without actually competing for it and without actually getting the better goods and services that are supposed to come with it. And having the government step in and regulate trusts, or bust trusts, as it's called, and say, here are some market practices that you can't do because they're unhealthy for the market as a whole, I think makes the market operate better. Another example would be the patent office and copyright laws. That's the government saying, hey, you economic entity, you can't do this thing because we're trying to, make it beneficial for people to invent stuff and to create brands and trademarks and stuff. And if you interfere with that, then it's worse for everybody. So we're all going to coordinate, which means we're going to prevent you from doing that. So that is another type of regulation. There are more than a couple examples of regulations that make the marketplace work better than it otherwise would. And I think that liberals will tend to introduce more and say, hey, here's another one which would have this nice benefit, or here's another one which would have this nice benefit. And of course, every time the government steps in, there's a cost. It's just a matter of, is there a benefit that justifies that cost? And I think that libertarians will require a lot more proof than the average liberal, and will be a lot more skeptical that it's really going to pay off. Yeah. Especially since, one regulation might in a vacuum be, net beneficial, but if it's sitting on a mountain of other regulations, maybe the whole thing ends up slowing down, and maybe the actual size of the regulatory agencies is a factor, and maybe they're going to prioritize trying to lower that back down. So that's the way that I think the two parties will generally see regulation, or those two different positions, which I guess correspond to left and right, will tend to see how to handle the free market. I'm going to call the liberal position more in favor of coordinated markets, and the more libertarian position more in favor of free markets. I think that sometimes I'm convinced by coordinated market positions, like the patent office and busting trusts and that sort of thing, where we all cooperate in order to get a better outcome. But not all the time. And there's a lot of shit that's been proposed that wouldn't have been worth it and isn't worth it. And locking myself into any position beforehand, I don't think is to anyone's benefit.
Gotcha. Okay.
Am I winning you over?
No, we're not quite getting
To the heart of your disagreement?
to the heart of it. Yeah, and it's but like I don't know. I think we uncovered a huge part that I had kind of glossed over, I guess, which was that you can hold these two values in tension and then make a judgment call on I don't know. It allows for the same flexibility that Aristotelian sense of freedom permits, and so that kind of solved that up. I guess what I'm also looking for is like a little more like just because you're calling it axiomatic, and maybe just because I'm so used to talking to you that I just don't even hear the axioms anymore, but because they are your axioms. But just like, okay, here's a problem. Let me shake it down to its essential problems. It comes down to these two values, freedom and happiness. I need to see it more geometrically, like how right now it just seems like these two values, liberty and happiness, have just been thrown out. I would like to see a clearer reductio ad liberty or happiness. You know, like a clear like, okay, like if what you're proposing is a like a standardized way to look at and clarify like political problems.
The criteria for weighing moral problems,
Yeah.
political problems,
Yeah.
etc.
Yeah, I'd like to hear more like that kind of rationale rather than like your understanding of like, well, evolution and here's how the market works. Like, we should kind of stay away from that so that it can be more as universal as possible, because not everyone agrees with evolution. Not that. Not everyone agrees with how the market works. But even with evolution, it's like you to make it even more most powerful, you have to avoid like any kind of practical application and keep it as tight as possible.
Yeah, so I mean, what I'm trying to do here is create the root of. I'm trying to give people the ability to make cases for certain positions, and making a case like this is the root of it. That my position is going to be the best for liberty and happiness, and here's why. And of course, people are allowed to bring in new information to describe this situation, to say how they think their actions are going to affect things, so that it all shakes out to more liberty and happiness. But yes, you're right, that my approach to this has been somebody pitches me a certain problem, and I say what my position is and defend why it's the best for liberty and happiness. As I make my cases, I'm going to talk about the market or evolution or whatever. So you want examples that don't require all this additional information from our actual universe. You want stuff that can be considered just abstractly and not.
No, no, not necessarily abstractly. It's unavoidable to have little handprints, but I guess I'm expecting something that probably is kind of unable to be communicated via just like a conversation, and like it needs more like rigorous like writing down like the premises and stuff. I don't know. That's just kind of what the pitch sounded like to me. It's like, all right, well, we're offering that's a bold, that's exciting, like a framework within to solve what you just said now, a framework within to solve like our community's disputes, and you're allowed to talk about evolution and I don't know how you think the markets work, but it always has to be in connection with like always touching those axioms of liberty and happiness. And so that's just one thing I was expecting more, which I you're ad-libbing, you know, so it's like I get it, but I'm just saying that's one thing.
Maybe here's something else that I sometimes do, which you might end up liking more. What I have been doing with you is deriving positions, but one of the other things that I can do is derive additional values which follow from liberty and happiness. Like, for example, democracy. Democracy makes sense as a form of government because it is a way for the people who are being governed to decide what the laws which govern them will be. In comparison to monarchy, democracy is better because democracy leads to more liberty and happiness. So well, that's still kind of a position. Let's say something that's more truly a value: security, right? So security is something that sometimes will pop up in political debates. Conservatives tend to say that they're, better for the national security. Uh, Security immediately follows from liberty and happiness. You need to have security in order to have liberty and happiness, because if someone can threaten you physically, not only can they cause you suffering, but they can take control of your experience, which damages, which lessens liberty overall. So security follows. You know what I mean? And we can do this for tons of other, sometimes I'll ask people what they would add or subtract from this set of values. So far, nobody has made a case. Nobody has said anything that has rung true in my mind and has made me decide that it's better. I'm presenting liberty and happiness to you because that's the best one I've heard so far. If there was another one that was better, that would be the one that I would be presenting to you now.
No, I don't know.
Yeah, but some people, when I've asked them, what would you add to this list, they've said, for example, truth. I think the truth does have value, but it has derived value. We need the truth so that we can have liberty and happiness. If we are being deceived, if we don't, what? Oh, you just said okay and then touched the screen. I thought that you were.
You're done.
We need the truth. If we don't actually understand the situation, then we don't know how to affect the situation. We don't know how our actions will actually affect the situation, and we can't control our own experience, so we lose out on liberty. We need the truth in order to get liberty. If we're being lied to, if we say, push this button and you'll be free, and it ends up killing people, then that's a terrible example, obviously. If we're being lied to, that this snake oil will cure your cancer or whatever, then now the control of our personal experience is in the hands of the liar, not in the hands of ourselves.
So security is violated, and therefore liberty and happiness.
Well, I would say liberty primarily is violated, but security is another example. Yeah. I mean, you could make that chain. You could add in different links if you wanted to. But we need the truth so that we can really understand our position and how our actions affect things, so that we can really control our own experience. Also, the truth has yielded many dividends to happiness. I mean, the more that we've understood the world, the easier it's been to protect ourselves and prevent suffering. So I would say that, the evidence suggests that more truth is better for happiness. Although sometimes, we can destroy comforting fantasies that, I guess, in the moment make us suffer, but I think overall it's better for happiness, and also overall it's better for liberty to have truth. But so truth, security, these other things, they can be derived from liberty and happiness. So maybe that would live kind of halfway between the abstract and the utilitarian, where we're kind of expanding. We're doing still abstract thinking, but we're actually doing work with liberty and happiness and seeing what we can get from it. Maybe that would be closer to what you were wanting and one of your remaining hang-ups. Because it wouldn't be, referencing evolution and stuff. It wouldn't be referencing actual data from our actual world. It could still be kind of half abstract.
Yeah, that's not really what I'm getting at, but it's not worth it right now. It's just gonna take more time to unhinge. But
you liking this?
Yeah, this is fun. This is good because, I need this.
Yeah, I think we all do.